Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start from scratch with the server fresh out of the box. I've plugged the server in, it's plugged into my UPS, and we've just powered up the server. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the RAID controller and we're going to configure the RAID array. So remember, this particular server has 6 1 terabyte SATA drives. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 of those SATA drives and configure them as a RAID 1 array. And then I'm going to take the other 4 and configure those as a RAID 10 array. So on our RAID 1 array we're going to put the operating system, and on our RAID 10 array we're going to put all of the virtual hard disks. So I press Ctrl R to go into the RAID controller, and as you can see, currently there's no configuration present. Now, depending on how the server is actually shipped out from the factory, for you, you may actually already have some kind of hard disk configuration. For me, I don't. So I'm going to go and I'm going to create my RAID arrays from scratch. So how do I do that? Well, first thing I want to do is I want to go in and go to operations, which I go into by choosing F2. So I'm going to create a new virtual drive. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my RAID level. So this is going to be RAID 1, which is just basically mirroring. And then I'm going to choose my first 2 drives in the machine. And then I'll tab across and I'll just give this a name, and I'll call this RAID 1 boot. So that's the name of this array, and I'll say OK. And now I'm going to go in and I'm going to create another array. So again, F2, create new virtual drive. In this case I'm going to set this as RAID 10, which, as you are probably aware, RAID 10 is a combination of mirroring and striping. So I get the best of both worlds. I get fault tolerance and I get performance. So I'll choose RAID 10, and I'm going to go in and select my 4 drives. And you can see this is now going to give me a virtual disk that's around about 1.9 terabytes in size. So I'm going to call this RAID 10 data, and I'll move across and I'll say OK. I don't need to change any of the advanced settings. These are pretty much standard. Obviously, if I was doing this for a SQL server or something like that, I might want to do some work around changing the stripe element size, but in this particular instance I don't need to do any of that. So I'll say OK, and that's now done. So then what I can do is I can now go and initialize the arrays. So I'm just going to do a fast initialization on the first one. So that's done, and then I'm going to go in here and again F2 for operations. I'm going to go into initialization and do a fast initialization. That's done, and you can now see that I have my virtual drives configured, my arrays configured, so now I'm ready to go. So I'll just say escape. Do I want to exit? OK. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to exit out, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to boot up into the systems management software. So you'll need to have, if you've got a Dell server like I have and you're following along, you'll need to have your systems management tools and documentation CD or DVD, and then you'll need to pop that into the drive, and you'll need to make sure that you select to boot from this particular DVD. You can see I'm getting a message, Control-Alt-Delete to reboot. Going to put my disk in the drive, so that's done. And then I'm going to press Control-Alt-Delete. and now the system's going to reboot for me. Now, just to make sure, when the system does reboot, because this is a Dell server, I'm going to have to press F11 to go in and make sure I select to boot from the optical drive. So we'll give this a couple of seconds to allow it to start back up again, and then I'm going to, at the appropriate time, press F11. So I'm just going to pause the recording at various times as we go through the configuration, just so you don't have to sit there looking at blank screens like this while it moves on to the next stage. So I've just hit F11, and you can see up here it's entering the BIOS boot manager. It just takes a couple of seconds. You can see that my virtual drives have now been found on the RAID array, so that's all good. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to use the Dell utilities to allow us to configure the new operating system, which is going to be Windows Hyper-V 2008 R2. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to choose to boot from my SATA optical drive, and then it's going to boot into the Dell utilities. That's now done. So I want the Dell Systems Build and Update utility. So I'll press Enter and go ahead and load that for me. So now you can see the system is booting, and again, this can take anywhere between 1 to 3 minutes depending on the speed of the drive that's in your server. So you can see now we're in the main configuration screen. And what do I want to do? Well, I basically want to go into my server OS installation because I don't really need to change any of the other options. I don't want to do a firmware update or anything like that. So I'm just going to go and configure my operating system. So my date and my time is all preset from the BIOS. So that's great. That's my time zones correct. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say continue. And I'm going to select my operating system, and the operating system I want to choose here is Windows Server 2008 R2. Even though it's Hyper-V, it's fundamentally the same underlying application or the same underlying architecture that's going to drive it from an installation perspective. So I'll choose Windows Server 2008 R2, I'll say continue. Then it's going to go ahead and double check my RAID configuration, and you can see there's the RAID configuration that we've already done. So our first system drive, 931 gigabytes, and that's RAID 1, and then our main drive with 1.8 terabytes is configured as RAID 10. So that's all good. I'm just going to leave that to retain the existing configuration. I'm going to say continue. And it's just confirming what I'm doing, and I'll say apply now, and the system will then move on to the next stage in the process, which is actually copying and configuring all the necessary underlying files for the operating system. So I'm just going to pause now while this goes through, and we'll come back when we're ready to move to the next stage. Once that Dell preparation is completed, the system automatically reboots. And you can see it's now starting to boot up into the Windows preload option, and in a second it's going to ask us to put in the installation DVD that we created in our earlier section where we downloaded Hyper-V from the Microsoft website and burnt that onto our DVD. See, it's asking me to insert a valid Windows Server 2008 DVD into the drive. It's automatically ejected the drive. Going to put the DVD in, give that a couple of seconds for it to spin up, and then I'll say OK. It's now going to check that that is actually a valid drive that it can install the operating system from. Give that a second or two. And you can see that a valid operating system installation media was found, so we'll press OK to start the install.
It's just telling us that the temporary partition that was created was going to be removed. And if something goes wrong during the operating system install, we're going to have to go back to the systems build and update utility and restart the process. So I'll say OK. Alright, you can see this is Microsoft Hyper-V Server 2008 R2. I'm just going to tell it my language is English. I'm going to pick my time and currency format being Australia because obviously that's where I'm based. And I'll say next. I'll choose install now, and now we'll let the Windows installation routine do its magic. Now this is a dual quad core machine, so we've got 8 cores. It's got 32 gigabytes of RAM, so it's got plenty of memory. So this should be a fairly quick process of doing the operating system install. And all things being equal, Windows Server 2008 or the Hyper-V 2008 R2 CD should actually have all the necessary drivers for your server. If it doesn't, you're going to obviously need to, at the appropriate point in time in the installation, insert the driver CD if you've got a different server with a different RAID controller and so on, and if the Windows Server installation doesn't recognize your hardware configuration. So I'm going to accept the license terms. I'm going to say next. I'm going to do a custom install, and you can see that the system has automatically recognized my RAID controller, so all the drivers that are needed for the RAID controller are automatically loaded. I'm going to install it onto disk 0. Now I could, if I wanted to, I could partition this drive out into, two 500 gigabyte partitions. In this case I'm just going to leave it as a 1 terabyte partition because all I'm really going to use this for is the operating system. So I'll choose that and I'll say next. And you can see away the system goes and the Windows installation kicks in. So once again I'm going to pause the recording. You've no doubt seen the Windows installation before. Nothing particularly spectacular here. We'll let this run, then we'll come back into the next stage of the configuration. Okay, so the system's now rebooted for the first time, and what we're doing, we're going in and the installation is just doing the final components that it needs to before it moves into, for Hyper-V, a character-based user interface. So we'll just let this continue on. So now you can see that your system has rebooted one more time, and it's now coming into the final stage of the Hyper-V installation. We get the traditional Windows message, the computer's being prepared for its first use. Getting our message that the user's password must be changed before logging onto the machine, so I'll say OK. And I'm going to put in my administrator password. Obviously choose a strong password and choose one that works for you. And the password's been changed and I'll say OK. So now what I'm getting is the final stages in the setup process, and you can see now I get the server configuration options, which are all character based when I'm working with Hyper-V.